What if I told you that some of the biggest features of our world and even our solar system could all be traced back to one single catastrophic event right here on Earth? Well, that's the wild idea behind something called the unified theory of geologic history. And today, we're going to dive deep and break down exactly how this model claims it all went down.
Yeah, you heard that right. This is the central question of the whole theory. Could one massive event explain our mountains, the craters on the moon, and the asteroid belt? It's a huge claim, so let's see how the theory even begins to connect those dots.
Okay, so first things first. To even get into this model, you have to understand that it starts from a completely different place than standard geology. It all comes down to what you use as your anchor for measuring the past. And here's where you see that huge split. Standard geology relies on things like isotope dating, which gives us timelines stretching back millions, even billions of years. But the unified theory? It throws that out. Instead, it argues that recorded human history is the only trustworthy measuring stick. And what does that do? It shrinks the timeline down to about 6,500 years. And if that's your timeline, then all those geologic layers couldn't have formed slowly. They had to have formed fast, really fast. This right here is the absolute key to the whole thing. You got to get this part. In this framework, written human history is it. It's the only timeline they see as verifiable. So all the physical evidence we find, rocks, fossils, canyons, it all has to be reinterpreted to fit inside that 6,500-year window.
So how do you get a global catastrophe in that short timeline? Well, it all kicks off with the theory's main event, the Great Rupture. And this is built on a foundational idea from Dr. Walt Brown's hydroplate theory, which was then expanded by Darrell Waters into the full-blown model we're looking at today. Okay, so the hydroplate theory is the engine here. The idea is that, before all this went down, there were massive amounts of water trapped under the Earth's crust, kind of like a planetary pressure cooker. So the Great Flood wasn't just rain coming down, it was an explosion coming up from below. And just look at how this is visualized. We are not talking about a gentle spring bubbling up. The theory describes a totally violent, high-energy event. Jets of water bursting out from under the crust at supersonic speeds, literally tearing the planet's surface apart. So how do you get from a rupture to continents moving? Well, the theory says it's a three-step process. First, the crust cracks open. Second, that escaping water becomes a supercritical fluid, which is this weird state of matter that's not quite liquid, not quite gas, but it acts as a nearly perfect frictionless lubricant. And that's the magic ingredient, because third, this lets the continents just slide, totally unhindered across the planet. And when I say slide, I mean slide. The calculations in this model suggest that some continents, like the plate-carrying India, could have hit speeds of up to 50 miles per hour. That's not slow, gradual geologic time. We're talking literal highway speeds. So just imagine for a second what happens when a landmass the size of a continent slams into another one at 50 miles an hour. According to the unified theory, the results aren't small. They are, quite literally, the biggest features on Earth. This view just changes everything. The Himalayas? Forget slow folding over millions of years. This model says they're the crumpled aftermath of a high-speed crash. And all those fossils of lush, temperate plants they find under the Antarctic ice? Well, in this story, that's just a chunk of the old world that slid down to the pole and was flash frozen in place. Even crazier, as all that water escaped from below, the theory says the whole planet actually shrank, increasing the force of gravity on the surface. The theory even has a fascinating take on Australia's unique wildlife. It suggests that while all the other continents were sliding around in chaos, Australia was kind of anchored to a stable piece of the crust. So instead of flying around, it just uplifted, creating this isolated island sanctuary that protected its unique animals, like all those marsupials, from the global mayhem. But believe it or not, the theory doesn't stop there. It argues that this initial rupture was so incredibly violent that it didn't just reshape the Earth, it had consequences for our entire solar system. I just love this way of putting it because it completely flips the script. Usually, we think of Earth as being a target for things from space, right? Asteroids, comets. But in this model, Earth isn't the victim. Earth is the source. It's the scene of the crime. And you can see the basic idea here. The force of that rupture was so immense that it literally blasted tons of rock, mud, and water straight off the planet and out into space, with enough oomph to escape Earth's gravity for good.
And this is how the theory really tries to unify everything. From this perspective, comets and asteroids aren't leftover bits from the birth of the solar system. No, they're ejected chunks of Earth. That, it says, would explain why we find things like salt and organic molecules on them. The asteroid belt? Not a failed planet, but a debris field that came from Earth. The theory even claims that granite, a rock we think of as distinctly continental, that's been found on the moon, was actually blasted there from our planet.
So let's pull all these pieces together and look at how this single story attempts to weave geology, biology, and even astronomy into one cohesive narrative. And that's why it's called the unified theory, right? It's not just a flood story. It's this one single mechanism that tries to explain pretty much everything: how the continents moved, where comets came from, why we have seasons, and even how life had to rapidly adapt to a totally new planet. I think if you take one thing away, it's this. In this model, the world we see around us, our mountains, our oceans, the very tilt of our planet, wasn't sculpted slowly over eons. Instead, these features are seen as scars, as the injuries left behind from one unbelievably violent and world-changing day. And that leaves us with a pretty big question to think about. At the end of the day, every model, whether it's this one or standard geology, is trying to tell a story that makes sense of the evidence. The unified theory tells a radically different story, for sure, but it's one that tries to tie everything back to a single moment. And that really makes you wonder, what's the appeal and what are the potential pitfalls of any theory that tries to explain everything all at once?